then we'll get started. Lord God, we are thankful again for this time. We're thankful for this letter to the Colossian Christians and what it means, not only what it meant for them, but what it means for us as well. And we're thankful that we can grow deeper into your love and grace and your challenge to live in the way of Christ as we reflect on these words and on this letter. So guide us now as we complete our study, and let your Spirit be among us as we do, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so today what I want to do, I've hinted at this throughout our time together, but I want to look a little bit at the discussion about authorship and how that relates to this particular letter. We've seen in Colossians, we've seen I'm calling it an argument. It's really just the kind of flow of thought where there is thanksgiving, there's prayer, there's then the body of the letter, which really elevates the person of Christ, God's work with Christ or in Christ. Paul's ministry for Christ, we saw in the second smaller section. And then when we get to chapter 2, verse 6, we see that the heart of the discussion in terms of the conflict that Paul is writing about. And so that's really the center section of the argument, of the discussion about what's going on in Colossae and what they're facing. And then after that, we have ethics, and we have a household code embedded in those ethics, and then we have the final greeting. So it's a short letter. It's a letter of concern. It's a letter that Paul writes to a group of people that he has not met, or that at least he didn't start the church. He knows some of them, but not many of them. And so he writes to them with these instructions. I want to just say two things by way of introduction. One is, again, authorship versus authority or inspiration. When we look at authorship, we're not asking the question, as some might, if Paul didn't write it, then is it authentic and is it authoritative? That's not my question. It might be somebody's question. It's not my question. The authority of Scripture, the inspiration, the revelation of Scripture, I believe happened as it was written, but then also as it was incorporated into the canon, into the New Testament group of books that we call the New Testament canon. And that's a different issue. We could sometime probably talk about how the church decided on these particular documents. But for me, it doesn't question the authority of the text if we try and figure out authorship. And if we say that Paul didn't write this. So for instance, what I would say in this particular case is that authorship is looking at the data in the content, in the text itself, whereas authority and inspiration is really a bigger issue that relates to books and letters that were in and were out of the canon. Now, I think, just to be fair, these letters were accepted into the canon probably as a result of believing that they had apostolic authority, which comes from Paul. So I don't want to deny that, but I've just separated the two issues. The way I would see the possibilities, and we'll look at some of the details then, the possibilities of this particular discussion in relationship to Colossians, that is the possibilities of who wrote it. I would say, on the one hand, the tradition, the history is that Paul wrote it later in his years, probably from Ephesus, perhaps from Rome. and is writing this in a little bit of a different style. He's older, he's more mature, and he's writing from that vantage point. So that's one option. Another option is that Paul's disciple, specifically, I would say Timothy, actually penned the letter. And then Paul, in his old age, in his shackles, in prison, could only write, didn't have freedom to really write, and could only write that this was in, the greeting was in his own hand. We saw that at the end of chapter 4. And so that's another option, that Timothy actually wrote it. It's Timothy's style. It's Paul's thoughts, but it's Timothy is writing it because Paul is unable to at this point. The third option, it seems to me, is that a later disciple wrote this letter believing this is what Paul would have said to the church of that person's time, whether it's 5 years after Paul died or 10 years or whatever. It would be after Paul died, and it would be Deutero-Pauline in the sense that it would come after. It would be a second Paul, if you will, what Paul might have wanted to say to the church a few years after he had died. So those are at least three possibilities. The other possibility is just it's a what some have called forgery. It's pseudonymous. It's by a person later who says his own stuff, but wants to have Pauline authority, and so says and makes the whole thing up. And I don't go that direction. Okay. So what are some of the issues that make scholars want to question the Pauline authorship? And by the way, let me just make one other review. There are in the New Testament, in New Testament scholarship, there are 7 authentic, undisputed Pauline letters: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. So those 7 of the 13 that are attributed to Paul are considered to be authentic. The 3 that are Deutero-Pauline, probably half think they're written by Paul, half don't, are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. And there are reasons for that. And then many people, I would say the majority, think that 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus were probably not penned by Paul, but by someone else. Okay, that's just New Testament scholarship. You can agree with it or not agree with it based on the data that we have. So some of the issues are as follows. One issue is the literary analysis, okay? Let me give you just some data about vocabulary. And this comes from Edward Loesch in one of his books. So this is his analysis. Any of us could make our own analysis of this, but this is how he has analyzed it. In Colossians, there are 34 what we call hapax legomenon, all the use of, or all the statement of a particular word. So that what that means is that all of these words are used only once in the whole New Testament. And there are 34 of those. They appear nowhere else, just in Colossians. There are 28 words that appear in the New Testament along with Colossians, but do not appear in other Pauline writings. Okay, so you have 34 and 28, which seems to skirt Pauline writings other than Colossians. There are 10 words that are only in Colossians and Ephesians, and both of those are questionable by scholarship today as to whether or not they're Pauline. So the 10 more are there. And then there are 15 words that are in Colossians and Ephesians, as well as the rest of the New Testament, but not in other Pauline letters. Okay, so that's just data. That's just vocabulary. We can't make a lot of it. I mean, we can't develop a whole understanding of what's going on here just on vocabulary. It could be that the vocabulary is specifically geared towards the problems that are there. Could be that the vocabulary is geared toward that particular geographic area, and they're just familiar with some words, and so it's tailored to that particular context and community. But we do have to say, okay, there's something going on here that seems to be a little different. Now, when you analyze something like Philippians, you can also get some of these kinds of differentiations in terms of vocabulary. So it's not a foolproof discussion at all. Then go to style. The style of Colossians, the writing of Colossians, is a bit different than what we call the 7 authentic letters of Paul. The sentences are longer, many of them, and we've seen that like in chapter 1, verses 3 to 8, chapter 2, verses 6 to 15. These are long, kind of convoluted sentences, which there are some in other Pauline literature, but it seems to be a bit more pronounced here. There isn't the same kind of argumentation in Colossians. Now, this again could be because of the situation and the context and the community. But in Romans, you have, should I say this? Absolutely not. Should we do this? Absolutely not. And it's like Paul has made this straw person that then he's knocking down throughout his discussion. And that's more of a diatribe. That's more of an argumentation kind. In Galatians, you just have this boom. Why are you doing this? And you shouldn't be doing this. And here are 6 reasons in chapter 2 and 3. Here are some reasons why what you're doing is not the right thing. And so he gives personal story and Old Testament and so forth and so on. Another stylistic feature, which I find fascinating, is that there are no Old Testament references and very few Old Testament allusions in Colossians. And when you look at something like Galatians, or you look at Romans, or you look at 1 Corinthians, any of those, there are such strong ties to Paul's Pharisaic background in terms of Old Testament, either allusions or quotes from the Old Testament. We don't have any of that. I shouldn't say any, we have very little of that in Colossians. Also, which I think is not untypical, but we have 2 probably early Christian, what would you say, not really documents, but pieces of literature that we find here that are not, that didn't originate with Paul. The Christ hymn in chapter 1 seems to be a hymn that circulated in the church. And the household codes in chapter 3 and early 4 seem to be a cultural reality that now appears in several of the post-Pauline, can I say, or Deutero-Pauline letters that aren't in any of the 7 what we call authentic Pauline letters. So when you have the household codes, that is, wives submit, husbands love, children obey, servants be obedient, and so forth. We don't have that in the 7 authentic Pauline. So what does that mean? Okay. And I think maybe even a more important issue is, in terms of style, is the idea that the writing, that what is kind of innate in a person's writing is missing in this. So Paul uses the little article or conjunction de, often, and it's used very little in this. In fact, the connectives are less here, and there are more participles. There are more statements that what they call pleonastic or tautological. It's extra words to say something. We're praying for you and asking. Well, why do you need to ask? I mean, you're praying and asking. It would be like, and I don't have one in front of me, but it would be like something like believing and the faith that you have, or some such thing. So often the noun and the verb have the same root. They come from the same kind of family, semantic family. So that appears more often in Colossians than in than in other of Pauline's writings, Paul's writings. Okay, so there's some stylistic things that we just have to account for. How do we do that? Do we say, well, that's because he's older and he is just writing differently because of the context? I don't think all of that makes sense in terms of context. It kind of flows out of who you are and how you have written in other places. So there's some differences. Okay. What about the content? So the literary analysis and then the content. The issues addressed, some would say the issues that Paul addresses, which is really kind of we call it the Colossian heresy, but it's really a religious, including both Jewish and pagan, or I'm not using that term pejoratively, but pagan meaning non-Christian, non-Jewish. A combination of those in terms of new moons and Sabbath and annual festivals, and then the shadow and the substance, and the elemental spirits or the elementary things. I mean, this kind of puts together the religious background, both pagan and Jewish background. And some would argue that that really didn't develop as a problem in the early church until later. Now that's, we could argue that. In order to counter the false teaching, Paul uses, or whoever wrote this, uses the Christ hymn and argues that there shouldn't be anything added to Christ, and then argues that case in chapter 2, verses 6 to 23, which is the main, I think, argument against the Colossian heresy that we have there. And that seems to follow what I would call a high Christology. The high Christology is in the Christ hymn in chapter 1. And what we have there is Christ as not only the head of the church, but the head of all rule and authority. Christ is the creator. All things were made by him and for him and through him, etc. So there's really, I would say, a next step in terms of understanding of who Jesus is, of who Christ is. I think this goes even beyond Philippians 2, where we have the kenotic theory, where the self-emptying of Jesus. I think that's really Adam Christology, which we could talk about at some point. But it's here, it seems to be even more elevated. And that seems to develop over the years of early Christianity, as opposed to right out of the chute. People weren't, I've said this, I don't think it's blasphemy. People would not have looked at Jesus and said, oh, there goes the second person of the Trinity. There was no concept of that when Jesus was walking. And yet, the early church had to make sense out of the reality of the resurrection. And so now we have the development, the thinking, the theological development of that as we move forward in the centuries. So the theology, there's a high Christology. There's also what we have called realized eschatology. And if you look at especially chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, you have this idea, not only were you buried, this is a Pauline idea, were you buried in baptism with Christ, but you were raised. You have been raised. It's a passive. I think it's a perfect participle or perfect indicative. You have been raised and you continue to be raised. That is, you've now entered into what you expected to enter into at the end of time. Chapter 3, verse 1 also. So you have this kind of elevated eschatology, we could say, realized eschatology as well. Is this Pauline? It seems to go a step beyond Paul. You have the forgiveness of sins. Sin is not a power. It's not an evil force. It's wrongdoing. That seems to be a little bit different than in some of Paul's writings. The shadow and substance talk about Christ. Don't follow the shadow when you have the substance that doesn't appear in other Pauline ideas. And ecclesiology, that is the study of the church, a word about the church. Christ is head not only of all rule and authority, Christ is also head of the church. And the idea of the church being the body of Christ, we see in other writings of Paul, but Christ as head of the body, we don't see. That's new here. Okay. I want to, so then what's missing? I think what's missing that seems to be Pauline, and it could be context, it could be what Paul is facing in this particular situation. But what's missing is righteousness by faith. That doesn't seem to appear here. Gentile inclusion, and that could be missing because the recipients are Gentiles. But there's no longer this struggle that you have in Galatians and you have in Romans about the place of the Gentiles in the early church. No, not only are they in the early church, but this is their church. This is the Gentile church that Paul is writing to, even if it has been influenced by Jewish theology and Jewish practice. Okay, and then I just have Old Testament quotes and so forth. There does seem to be kind of a settledness of the church, which Paul was starting churches. This seems to be much more settled, and so in that sense, it seems to have existed for a while, and Paul's writing to help them live worthy of the gospel. He's not proclaiming the gospel in that sense. He's helping them live worthy of the gospel. Okay, let me stop with those kind of things. Now, none of this is a ironclad case against Pauline authorship, but it just raises the question, okay, who is the author? What do we do? And did Paul write this, or did somebody else write it? It doesn't sound exactly like other letters of Paul, so what do we do with it? So who wrote Colossians? Well, the options are, again, Paul in his older age with new issues facing the church, using different literary style. That's one option. My best hunch is that Timothy wrote it. Timothy was Paul's companion. Timothy is writing not what Paul might say, but he's interpreting Paul for this particular context a bit later in the development of early Christianity. He's a disciple of Paul. He knows Paul. He's interpreting Paul for a new generation, or at least a new context. But it's still very likely under Paul's guidance. So it may be that it's Deutero-Pauline in the sense that the style and the context gives us a different feel. But if we take seriously chapter 4, verse 18, where Paul says, I'm writing this in this greeting in my own hand, then this is later in Paul's life. It must have been in the mid 60s. And that would be my best guess. The other option, and I wouldn't oppose this option, but another option is that Paul has recently died. The church is still in its infancy. They're trying to be faithful. And one of Paul's disciples, again, interpreting Paul for their particular situation, is now writing to them in Paul's name, as has been done in other letter writings, in Paul's name, with Paul's authority. This is what Paul would say if Paul was still here to your situation. Okay, so of those three options, I would probably take option B, Timothy, under Paul's guidance, but interpreting Paul, not just simply restating what Paul might exactly say. But it could bend further into later. The problem I have with later is that there was an earthquake in Colossae and in the Lycus Valley in 60-61, a couple of years before Paul was traditionally executed in Rome. And there's no understanding that Colossae was rebuilt. Laodicea was rebuilt, Hierapolis was rebuilt, but there's no historical data, archaeological data, that Colossae was rebuilt. So it may well be that this came in the early 60s, maybe late 50s before the earthquake, or after the earthquake, there was some rebuilding and the letter went to them. Some people think that actually, well, no, I'm just going to stop there.
Okay. As we've done, please put your questions in the chat or use the reaction button to raise your hand. Mary Lee says the last item being the settledness of the church might be an argument for the purposeful change of style. And then he asks, can you repeat the first option? Or she asks if you could repeat the first option.
Well, I would say the first option is that Paul, in his older age, with kind of new issues facing the church and using a different literary style, penned in terms of physically writing the whole thing. I mean, it's possible. The thing about literary style is it seems to be almost, what do I want to say? Not automatic or more part of Paul's personality than simply, oh, well, let's see, I'll do this literary style here and this literary style there. It seems to me that it's more intuitive, more part of how Paul would write, whether he's writing as a young man or an older man. So yes, it's possible that he uses a different literary style. This seems to be more innate, but maybe not. So sure.
So additionally, Sally and now other people are chiming in, saying that they are curious about what you were going to say before you stopped yourself.
Well, I was going on a tangent with the idea that some people think that this letter actually is the letter to the Laodiceans that Paul wrote, that it was renamed and sent to Colossae. They would know that intuitively. They would know that it was really for Laodicea. and that we don't have that this is then what some have called the lost letter to the Laodiceans. That doesn't make as much sense to me. I think I don't know that they would automatically understand that a letter addressed to Colossae would be a letter for the Laodiceans. I think the switching of letters makes more sense. Like, read that letter, let them read this letter, and so forth.
And
so you
Monica
can see it was
is
a tangent.
Monica is saying that we love your tangents, and then Mary has a hand raised. So go ahead, Mary.
Well, this makes me sad. The idea, but I like the idea that we have so little from Paul, and it's like, oh, and it reminds me of when one generation moves on to the next, and I don't know, it's kind of like Moses to Joshua, or the best generation. But anyway, so I guess, can you remind us who Timothy is, and whether, like, what his education would have been, and
yeah.
And does the church become quickly less Jewish with this change of generation? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So Timothy was a disciple of Paul that either he or others, his grandmother, I think, converted in Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, in the eastern central part of Asia Minor. Paul met him on his first missionary journey. He took him then on his second missionary journey. Timothy had a Greek father and a Jewish mother. So in a certain sense, and then Timothy followed Paul around in his travels. In a certain sense, Timothy makes a lot of sense to me, because you have an understanding of both the Greco-Roman world from his father and the Jewish world from his mother. And what appears here as the Colossian heresy is that there is some combination of the religious traditions that are in both worlds. And Timothy, it seems to me, would have been a person who would have known both those worlds and could speak to it and interpret, in a sense, Paul's thoughts in the context of that world. Now, Paul was a Jew from Tarsus, and he had both a Jewish mother and father. Then he went to Jerusalem and studied, became a Pharisee. So he was very steeped in Hebrew Bible, Hebrew scripture, Jewish practice, and so forth. But he undoubtedly knew the Greco-Roman context as well. But Timothy would have learned that from inside the home. Paul would have learned it outside. So it seems to me that Timothy, although we don't have other writings of Timothy, Timothy is a good candidate as one who now has attached himself to Paul as a disciple of Paul's, goes with Paul in these missionary journeys, and knows Pauline thought as well as Greco-Roman and Jewish religious thought, and could really put something like this together well. Seems to me that would be a logical possibility. By the way, let me say this also. I confess this in other contexts. When I first heard these ideas that Paul didn't write Colossians, or Paul didn't write Timothy, to 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy or whatever, for me, I thought, oh, that's crazy. But once I started thinking about it and analyzing things, the same with the Gospels, it was a crisis of faith. I grew up believing that the Bible was literally true, and that the tradition, and I still think it's true, and that the traditions of authorship were not just traditions, but were actually true. The thing is, We don't know. I mean, in the Gospels, they're all anonymous. Those attributes of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John come from the early church after the Gospels had been read and assimilated and talked about. It's not like I, Matthew, am writing this gospel, or I, John, am writing this gospel. No. I think the same is true here. When you look at letter writing convention, when you look at what's going on in the early church, for instance, in quoting people, the philosophers, they never said, Aristotle said. Well, I shouldn't say never. That generally they would just quote Aristotle, for instance, and everybody knew that this was Aristotle from Aristotle. They knew it. It's not like they were trying to pull the wool over somebody's eyes or say, I'm as smart as Aristotle, look at what I say, and it's really Aristotle. No. So there wasn't the same kind of attribution, the same kind of footnoting that we have today. And for people to write in someone else's name is not unheard of in the conventions of early letter writing and other kind of writing. It was actually an honor to write in somebody's name as opposed to what is called today false writing or plagiarism. But for me personally, it was a crisis of faith when I realized, oh, maybe Paul didn't write this. Well, who says he didn't write it? Well, then you have to go to the data, and the data is the text itself. And then you have to say, okay, well, why is it different? Why are there no Old Testament quotes? I mean, if Paul wrote this, Paul was a Pharisee. He could have supported his argument, but we don't have that. So you just have to make sense of the data. And again, I'm making a distinction between the authority of Scripture, which I don't question at all, and authorship. Authorship doesn't necessarily equate to authority. It may well be that Timothy wrote this in Paul's name with Paul's signature, but he's interpreting Paul, and that's according to what I would say the early church and the Spirit of God working in pulling the New Testament canon together. It's just as authoritative and just as important as Romans or as one of the other books. That was a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, thank you so much. That looks like that's it. And I just want to add that I hear from so many people all the time in emails and comments about how rich these sessions are and how much people really appreciate your doing this. So thank you. So I think we're ready to close.
Almost. I want to also thank Linda and Randy. Linda has carried the bulk of getting us online, and I couldn't do this without her. So thank you so much, Linda, and appreciate it. Okay, let me close us then with a word of prayer. God, we are so thankful for your word. We're thankful that it comes to us in a variety of ways, that is, in a variety of styles, gospels, letters, sermons, apocalyptic writing, all of it we accept as your word, your authoritative, inspired, revealed word to us. Help us as we try to live worthy of the gospel, worthy of Christ in our life. And thank you for all that you give to us through feasting on your word. Guide us now as we go, and let us live your gospel in all of our life. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And I should add one other thing. We don't know the exact format or timing of the follow-on sessions, but I do have the email list, so whenever we find that out, I can send it out and send you the link so that you can register for the new whatever it is.
Great, thanks.